Hello and welcome to the Classics Capsule again with me, Sean McKeon, and today I'm going to be looking at one of the greatest superheroes really of all time, and also a very peculiar set of circumstances around that exact same character. The superhero in question was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster for Action Comics in April 1938, and he's from a planet called Krypton and he's known as Superman. Well, Superman has had a number of different incarnations. The very first one, as I said, was in comics. He's now owned by DC Comics and still features in DC Comics to this day. But the very first adaptation of Superman outside of the comics was in 1940 and was on the radio and was aimed very much at children, and Superman on the radio was voiced, whatever you want to say, by a gentleman named Bud Collyer. Bud Collyer went on to great fame in becoming the first game show host on American television. He was very, very well known for being involved in things like Beat the Clock, and usually going completely over the top in Beat the Clock as well. But he was very, very well known from 1940 to 1951 as the voice of Superman. The radio series very, very much aimed at children. The episodes were 10 to 15 minutes in length, generally going along the lines of a serial with a cliffhanger at the end of each episode. But in 1941 there was a series of animated shorts produced in the cinemas, again aimed very much at children, and Superman again was voiced by Bud Collyer, although the facial similarities were very much along the lines of DC Comics or Action Comics rather than what Bud Collyer actually looked like. Those shorts were all released by Paramount Pictures, and the model shots and all of the model sequences and everything were all provided by Joe Shuster, who was the original artist for Superman in the Action Comics. The first live action thing for Superman was in 1948 and was a movie serial along the lines of the things like Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers and other things like that, where you would have the heroes at the end of each episode in some kind of perilous danger. And in these, Superman was played by Kirk Allen. Kirk Allen went on to very much regret ever being involved with Superman, because he reckoned it completely killed his career. He became far too closely associated with the role, and as a result of that he didn't really get that much other work. Certainly as a lead actor he was relegated after doing these to doing voiceovers or doing completely uncredited guest parts in a number of films and television series. But we will look at that in a short while. In 1950 there was another live action thing named Atom Man vs Superman, which is a bit of an oddity really, because while it's live action insofar as you have actors talking and walking around and whatever else, whenever Superman was seen to fly, the whole thing became an animation. There was no attempt made whatsoever to make Kirk Allen actually fly around as Superman. It was just done as a cartoon, which was then cut back to Kirk Allen in costume. The animated sequences, just to make it look even worse, were composited into live action. So you had a cartoon version of Superman flying around real America. The first time Superman appeared in what was classed as a feature, it was a B-movie picture, Superman and the Mole Men. And it was in 1951, and Superman in this was played by an actor named George Reeves. And in this B movie, it had one particular role, and that was to launch a television series of Superman. And to say that that had a troubled beginning is putting it very, very mildly. The film was released, and the film was a success. And so there was a television series based on Superman, again played by George Reeves. All of the cast from the film went into the production of this thing, and then partway through the production of making the first season of the Adventures of Superman, the production was cancelled, and it left the whole thing in a massive limbo. It was only resurrected when Kellogg's, the breakfast cereal company, came along and sponsored the Adventures of Superman. And then everything that had been filmed for the first season was then shown. And it was a success, but it was a bit of a controversial success, and it was actually, for the time, very, very gritty and quite violent. As in the past, Superman had been very much a character aimed at children. This was aimed more towards a general audience rather than just specifically at children, although naturally enough children did form a very, very large body of the audience for it. George Reeves was a very, very charismatic version of Superman, even though he was very, very similar as Superman and as Clark Kent. But there is quite a funny side to the whole thing. And when the second season for Superman started, the original Lois Lane, who was Phyllis Coates, because no one really thought that Superman was even going to be shown on the television after they went into a production hiatus. And then when it was shown, it became a much bigger hit than anybody ever anticipated, including the cast. Phyllis Coates had got herself a lot more work lined up and was not available to go back to be Lois Lane again. And so, as a result of that, Lois Lane was recast by an actress named Noelle Neal, who had played Lois Lane opposite Kirk Allen in the features, in the serials. And when the second season started, Kellogg's decided that they wanted the main stars of the Adventures of Superman to appear in television commercials promoting Kellogg's breakfast cereals, and also, of course, to promote the television series. And so George Reeves as Superman was seen in these alongside Jack Lawson, who was Jimmy Olsen, and John Hamilton, who played Perry White. The only one who was never asked to appear in these commercials was Noelle Neal. And it was because it was considered that it would be far too suggestive to have Lois Lane and Superman having breakfast together. So, while you saw Superman eating his bowl of cornflakes, you never ever saw Lois Lane, because the companies were terrified of what people would think, and think there was some kind of romantic liaison going on between Superman and Lois Lane. Mm-hmm. The television series became synonymous with its introduction, and one of the phrases from the introduction is still pretty widely used for Superman today. In its full version, it is faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, and able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Look up in the sky. Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's Superman! The number of times you still hear that in relation to this character is unbelievable. The major difference in the television series compared to what had gone on in the cinema was that in the flying sequences you actually saw George Reeves taking part in the flying scenes. It wasn't animated, it wasn't done in any way, shape or form like that. It was done using a combination of wires in Superman taking off and landing, and the actual flying George Reeves would lie flat on a flat surface while a skyscape would be flashed past him to make it look like he was flying. The only downside of this, of course, was that the George Reeves' stomach, chest and thighs very often appeared flattened because he was lying on a flat surface. The use of wires for Superman taking off was abandoned when George Reeves was injured in an accident when they were filming one sequence, and as he was lifted up into the air as though he was taking off, the wires collapsed and he dropped some 8 to 9 feet back to the ground and suffered concussion. After which the use of a springboard was used, where the camera would be positioned immediately next to the springboard, and George Reeves would run towards the camera and jump onto the springboard and then fly off over the cameras and land on padded flooring, which in my opinion is a lot more dangerous than being hoisted up on wires, but you know, there you go. This is the 1950s, health and safety was not as rigorous as it is today, because today I doubt very much you get away with doing that. The series was a huge success right the way through its run, right the way through to 1958, and then a series of tragedies struck when the actor who played Perry White, John Hamilton, very sadly died suddenly. And then just to cap it all off, George Reeves himself was killed. Circumstances behind George Reeves's death were very suspicious then and are still suspicious now. It was ruled as a suicide, and there was a belief that he was suffering from depression and that his mind was being disturbed by being Superman, and he was starting to believe that he was Superman and that he would survive a bullet being fired at him, and so he fired a bullet at himself and shot himself in the head. The downside with that theory is that his fingerprints were never found on the gun which killed him, but it was ruled as a suicide. So, however, because this was still a very, very successful series, the television networks decided they wanted it to continue. But rather than cast another actor as Superman, which would have been the tasteful way of doing it, they decided to rebrand it as Jimmy Olsen, Superman's pal.
Okay.
And the idea was that Jack Lawson as Jimmy Olsen would become the main character, and they would feature Superman in flashback sequences of George Reeves from previous episodes. Lawson rejected the idea out of hand as being in such bad taste it was untrue, and so with him refusing to have any part in that, the Adventures of Superman died a very, very sad death. It was then 20 years before Superman reappeared in any sort of cinematic or television guise. There were cartoons which were nowhere near as successful, but then in 1978 Superman the movie was launched. And this was a film, like the television series, with quite a troubled beginning. The development for it started off in 1973 when Ilya Salkind and his father Alexander Salkind started trying to get the rights to make a film from DC Comics, and DC Comics really were not keen on the idea. Eventually negotiations were successful and a script was written, the idea being that the first 2 Superman films would be made back to back. So a script was written whereby that was going to be the case, and the script was nearly 700 pages long. Rather than just show Superman being in existence on Earth, it shows the whole life of Superman, starting on his home planet of Krypton as a baby, Krypton being destroyed, and then Superman subsequently arriving on Earth, growing through adolescence, and then arriving in the city of Metropolis, as Clark Kent stroke Superman. DC Comics wanted final say in the casting of Superman, and so a range of actors, and in one case not an actor, were put forward to DC Comics. The list of names considered for Superman were Al Pacino, James Caan, who, when he was asked to be Superman, he was actually quite taken with the idea until he saw the Superman costume, and then turned it down flat because he said there's absolutely no way I am going to wear that suit. Steve McQueen was considered for it. Clint Eastwood. Dustin Hoffman.
Oh God.
Dustin Hoffman, interestingly enough, when he turned down the role of Superman, was then offered the role of Lex Luthor, who he turned that down flat as well. He wanted no part in this. The other one that was put forward at the very beginning of this entire process, which DC Comics, believe it or not, okayed, was Muhammad Ali.
Oh God, no.
At this point, the film was going to be made in Italy, at the very, very famous Cinecittà Studios in Rome. Pre-production was underway. A director had been assigned to it, none other than Guy Hamilton, who was a very, very famous assistant director on films such as The African Queen, and was a veteran of the James Bond films by this point. However, a very unexpected problem arose, because cast as Superman's father on Krypton was Marlon Brando. And Marlon Brando had an outstanding warrant for his arrest in Italy on public decency charges as a result of appearing in a film called Last Tango in Paris. And the minute Marlon Brando had set foot in Italy, he would have been arrested. So he was not able to film in Italy, where all the studio scenes were going to be filmed. So the idea of filming at the studios in Rome was abandoned. And production then shifted to Pinewood Studios in Britain, which then produced another problem because Guy Hamilton was in tax exile, and the minute he set foot back in Britain would have been due to pay an awful lot of money to the British government, which he was not prepared to do, and so Guy Hamilton dropped out of being the director of Superman the movie. So they now had part of a cast, no lead actor, a script that was massively overlong, and no director.
What was that?
The problem of a director was solved fairly quickly. The original choice to take over from Guy Hamilton was Steven Spielberg, but he had a film in pre-production at that time named Jaws, and the studios wanted to see how that worked out before they approached Spielberg. If it flopped, they weren't going to be interested. However, Jaws became a massive international hit, and so Spielberg was approached. However, he wasn't available because by that point he was already committed to making Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But salvation came from quite an unlikely source when a film called The Omen became quite an unlikely success, even though it is brilliant. The Omen being directed by Richard Donner. And the film company, when they saw what was going on with The Omen and saw the work that Richard Donner had done, approached him to make Superman, and he jumped at the chance. But when he got hold of the script, he decided that it was way, way, way too long, it was unworkable, it was camp, and it was not the sort of film that he wanted to make. So he brought in Tom Mankiewicz to rewrite the whole thing. Unfortunately, Tom Mankiewicz wasn't allowed a screen credit as the writer, so he's credited on the film as a creative consultant. Then came the problem again of who to cast as Superman. The original thought was that it needed to be an A-list big name star, and as such Robert Redford was approached. and Robert Redford felt that he was far too famous to be Superman, so he said no thank you to it. Burt Reynolds turned the part down flat. Paul Newman was given a choice of playing either Superman, Lex Luthor or Jor-El, with problems having arisen with Marlon Brando, even working in London, which I'll come to in a moment. Paul Newman was offered $4 million to play any one of these three roles, and he turned every one of them down. Marlon Brando, meanwhile, had flatly refused to learn any of his lines, and so he was insisting that they use cue cards around the set. Richard Donner then succeeded in casting Superman when he cast Patrick Wayne. And at that point things were going very, very smoothly. The cast was all in place. And then John Wayne, Patrick Wayne's father, was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. And Patrick Wayne, as a result, dropped out of the film. And that immediately left them again, we've got no Superman. A name that had been linked with it was an unknown actor really at the time, Christopher Reeve. It was felt that as an unknown, and he was also too young, he wouldn't really be suitable for the part. However, because of the situation that they were in, they agreed that Christopher Reeve should at least be screen tested, and he absolutely blew everybody away and was offered the part there and then. Much to the disappointment of a British actor who had started his career as a bodybuilder named David Prowse, who had been very, very successful and become very well known as Darth Vader, the body of Darth Vader, and who had lobbied very, very hard to play the part of Superman. But he was refused an audition because he wasn't American, and there was no way he could put on an American accent, and really the thought of Superman having a West Country accent is terrifying, but that's what we would have got had Dave Prowse got the part. The unfortunate thing was that Dave Prowse received a telephone call before it was known that Christopher Reeve had been cast. He gets a telephone call from the producers of the Superman film asking him to go to Pinewood Studios in relation to the Superman film. And he thought that he was going to either audition to be Superman or to be offered the role of Superman. And when he arrived at the studio, he was introduced to Christopher Reeve and told, bulk him up, because he doesn't look like Superman, he's got to have the muscle tone, and he's refusing to wear a muscle suit for it. So Christopher Reeve then spent the best part of the next 6 weeks in David Prowse's gym, being worked into the ground. And as a result, he developed the physique that was needed to be Superman. The film was made on a budget of $55 million. It was a gigantic budget for this film. The cast for it, some of the names they got for it: Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor. To this day, Gene Hackman still insisted that it was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made getting involved with Lex Luthor. He hated the part, and he hated the films, and freely admit he only did it for the money anyway. But you know, both he and Ned Beatty both had some very much needed light relief, because everybody else played it very much po-faced. Gene Hackman has the approach of pretty much the same with sort of like the way that Jack Nicholson did with the Joker in the Batman film. It was very much a performance of, do I really want to be doing this? No, not really, so let's just have a laugh. He is absolutely wonderful, and really for me he is, it's ironic because he didn't want to do the thing, but he is, if not the best, certainly one of the best actors to have taken on the role of Lex Luthor. The film itself, the special effects in it were absolutely incredible. The flying sequences in particular were using in those days blue screen. a technique pioneered by the BBC, funnily enough, in Doctor Who in the early 70s and perfected by George Lucas in Star Wars. It had never been used for anything quite like this before, and no one really knew if it would work or not, but it is absolutely seamless, and it is genuine. And the tagline for the film became, "You will genuinely believe a man can fly," because it does look genuinely believable that Christopher Reeve is flying around. Including the scene where he's flying, he takes Lois Lane, now played by Margot Kidder, for a flight around the city, and then subsequently drops her and swoops down and catches her again. It all looks realistic. 3 sequels followed. The second film really followed on from the success of the first. It is a continuation of the story a lot more than the others are. The third film, the cracks are beginning to show a little bit in it, really. The villains in it aren't really that good. Robert Vaughn again tries to go hugely over the top and fails spectacularly. Richard Pryor as a sort of comic relief villain. He's a sort of henchman at the start and then becomes a hero at the end of the film and saves Superman's life. He's about the only saving grace in the whole film, really, but worse was to come with Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, when, very much like Batman and Robin, if ever there's a film where you sit and watch it and think, why did they ever bother, this is that film. And it was a really, really sad ending to what was quite a successful franchise at that particular point in time. The fourth Superman film forgets what it's there to do, really. Rather than tell a story and be entertaining, it becomes very, very preachy. And it really does fail in that respect. And unfortunately, it was the last Superman film made by Christopher Reeve. And this brings me to what is a very, very strange thing about Superman. And it is known as the Superman curse. In that there is an inordinate number of people who have been involved with Superman, either in a creative side or actually appearing in the films, who have suffered such incredible bad luck. And it all seems to be centred around this one character. Kirk Allen had quite a respectable career until he took on the role of Superman. And he became so identified with the role, he then was only considered for voiceovers or commercials, or was uncredited in appearances that he made. The upshot of it all was he actually appeared in the 1978 Superman movie as Lois Lane's father, when Lois Lane is seen as a young girl, along with Noel Neill playing Lois Lane's mother. It's quite a nice little flashback to the original series. The only problem was that in the cinematic release, their dialogue scenes were actually cut from the film. They were reinstated for the VHS and DVD releases. But again, you could say it's this curse aimed, like, it's affected Kirk Allen again. He had some dialogue and it was taken out of the film. Bud Collyer, he had developed a very, very successful career hosting game shows on American television. In 1969, he developed a medical condition that affected his blood circulation, and he died. And at the tragically early age, really, of 61 years of age. George Reeves, as I said, ruled as committing suicide, even though there's very, very strange circumstances behind his death. The young child who played Superman as a baby in the 1978 film was Lee Quigley. And Lee Quigley died in 1991, aged 14, from solvent abuse. Christopher Reeve, like Kirk Allen before him, became very, very typecast as Superman, and he wasn't offered any more lead roles. He was offered an awful lot of supporting roles in a lot of other things. And he was
very good.
He was very, very good in just about everything he did. But then, tragically, in 1995, he was taking part in a cross-country equestrian event, and he was thrown from his horse and was paralysed from the neck down as a result. He was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He still carried on acting, even though he was in a wheelchair. And again, some of the things he did at this stage of his life and his career, they're absolutely breathtaking and very, very courageous. He sadly died in 2004 from heart failure, which was brought on by the medical conditions that he suffered from as a result of the horse accident. His widow, who was Dana Reeve, she died aged 44 from lung cancer, and she was a non-smoker. Richard Pryor made Superman 3 in 1983. Very, very successful career as a stand-up comedian, a very funny stand-up comedian. 2 years after he made the Superman film, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and he died from a heart attack in 2005. And then Margot Kidder, who was Lois Lane in the Superman series with Christopher Reeve, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and died in 2018 from drug and alcohol abuse, and her death was again ruled as suicide. The current Superman is an actor named Henry Cavill, or Cavill, however you want to pronounce his surname, who has played the role 3 times now in Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman and Justice League. He puts it all down to just people suffering bad luck. It's interesting, and it's worthy of a little bit of speculation really, because Henry Cavill is one of the front runners to take over from Daniel Craig as James Bond after the next Bond film due to release next year. Henry Cavill is contracted to play Superman one more time and has said he will not break that contract. He will play Superman once more. It will be interesting to see if he still puts down the Superman curse as bad luck if he misses out on being Bond, because he's still under contract to being Superman. That's not a situation that is unknown to the Bond films, which we'll look at when the Bond films are looked at in the next couple of editions of the capsule. The Superman films of the 1970s, they were groundbreaking. They were the first motion pictures of the size and scale centred around a superhero. There hadn't been anything like them before. They were the forerunners really to the Batman films, which started in the 1980s, and as such they are something that we really, really should tip our hats to and say a very, very fond thank you to. To this day, the first 3 of them still are entertaining. The first one, it's never really been bettered. Christopher Reeve, for me, has never really been bettered as Superman. Dean Cain on television, he was more of a model than Superman, really. He wasn't really right for it. Brendan Routh in Superman Returns. The film itself wasn't actually that bad, but I mean, really, Brandon Routh, he brings about as much life and personality to Superman as a housebrick would. So miscast in that film, it's untrue. But I actually think he was cast because he bears an uncanny resemblance to Christopher Reeve in the Superman suit. He really does look very similar to him. But in terms of acting ability, no, sorry. Henry Cavill is a good actor, he's a Shakespearean actor. He certainly looks the part as Superman. He isn't quite as charismatic as Christopher Reeve was, but he plays Superman very much in his own way. And it will be interesting to see how he develops the part further should he go on to play the part one more time. Will it be a worthy addition to the Superman legend? Only time will tell, and I look forward to actually reviewing those films in a little bit more detail when the time comes to do that. In the meantime, please pass your comments on the original Superman films, and any films, any series, any genres you would like to see examined in the Classics Capsule, please let us know either on Facebook or YouTube. Until next time, this is Sean McKiernan in the Classics Capsule signing off. Thank you.